This video was made in association with KnifeInformer.com. Head on over to Knife Informer for all of your blade-related needs, including reviews, comparisons, stats, and more. What is up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Collection Commentary. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at this Rick Barrett Fallout Midtech. The Fallout model comes in a few varying degrees. There is the Riate production version of the Fallout, as well as the Midtech version, and then there's kind of like varying degrees of the Midtech depending on the level of customization and everything. And then there are, of course, the full Rick Barrett customs, which are actually made by Rick and are fairly expensive. I got this knife for a pretty reasonable price on the secondary market. The Midtechs tend to go for anywhere between, from what I've seen, anywhere between like $500 and $600, depending on the level of kind of customization. There's a couple out there that are like super plain that are available for a little bit less, like maybe like $450, $475. And then there are obviously a couple out there that are a little bit more expensive as well, getting closer up to $800. But I got a pretty good price on this one on the secondary, and I want to go ahead and jump into the features and flaws. So the big reason that I purchased this knife in the first place, and one of my favorite aspects about it, is this incredible anodization on the presentation side. And you can really see how the light just plays off of the knife. And it really likes to dance. It's got this really interesting sheen to it that I really appreciate. And there's a lot of different milling patterns going on as well on the presentation side. You can see here we have kind of this square pattern, this little checker pattern. And then you, of course, get the kind of wavy pattern all the way up through here and through the rear here. And so that's pretty neat. I really like how this wave pattern kind of starts like this and then kind of like dissipates into like a thin... It almost isn't even a pattern anymore. It's just like a texture. So it's pretty cool how the kind of waviness flows in and out of itself. And I just think that that was something that was really easy to appreciate. The lock side, however, is not as stellar to me. The colors get a little bit more kind of bronzy. You can see there's... I don't know, I would consider them almost imperfections in the anodization, though I'm given to understand these are done by hand, so it's kind of natural to have some of that through there. But on the clip, you can see particularly there's a lot of red and kind of bronze and yellow coming through, which doesn't entirely match the rest of the knife, so not my favorite aspect of it, but that is personal preference, so I'm going to leave that kind of, it is what it is. But the lock side definitely doesn't quite do it for me aesthetically as much as the presentation side. But that's okay, because the presentation side is exactly what it is. It's for presentation. So moving on, the frame, you know, it's awfully thin for such a big knife. It is contoured very well, so when you actually hold it in your hand, it feels thick enough. It's fairly filling, but you can see the edges... as the contouring kind of dissipates to the edges, that it gets fairly thin, and so when you actually grip it, it almost feels like too thin. Like you can feel these edges not like digging into your hand so much that there's like a hot spot, but it just doesn't quite feel as solid as something like maybe like a Bodega that's kind of in this size range that has a little bit more thickness to the edges, just so there's a little bit more contouring and everything like that. So, yeah, I don't want to say that it's too thin to be comfortable in the hand, but it just, you kind of get this sense that it's a fairly thin knife for its overall size, which is kind of interesting, especially with the blade stock, which ultimately isn't as thick as you might expect on a knife as large as this one. And so speaking of kind of this thinness around the frame, the area for disengagement seems kind of almost like it was abandoned. So basically, when I disengage the knife, it's very uncomfortable. This little thin area here has no contouring. It's just a 90-degree angle. It's definitely a hot spot, as well as the fact that it doesn't feel very premium. When you are looking at a Midtech, you know, you want some special attributes to the knife. You want it to feel a little bit more premium, feel a little bit more well put together. And, disengaging the lock bar is a big part of a knife, especially if you are somebody that, just likes to fondle your knives and flip them and stuff more than anything else, fidget, so to speak. You're disengaging the lock bar quite a bit on a knife. And so it's a really important place for a maker to apply focus, and it really just isn't addressed here in any way. Like I said, it's very thin. It's definitely a hot spot. Because of the thinness, you kind of don't have that premium feel. It feels more like a cheaper budget knife when I'm disengaging the lock bar, and ultimately that is an area where there could have been more attention that I think would have made a fair improvement on the knife. Which kind of brings me to the greater point, which is that overall the knife feels a little bit cheap for the price. The more that I carry it and the more that I hold it, the less I kind of have that feeling. It is something that I had down in my notes, just because when you're talking about a knife kind of in the $500 something price range, you want it to feel really solid. You know what I mean? You don't want a whole lot of vibration through the handles. You want there to kind of be attention to the details that matters, like things with like the lock bar and everything. And so just between kind of the sound of the action and then how much effort was really put into these handles in terms of like the contouring and everything, it feels a little bit on the cheaper side. Like everything's just a little bit lighter. Everything vibrates a little too much for me. I think the fact that the standoffs that it's on are only down here and not through the center up here, it definitely doesn't help the knife. And a lot of makers don't like putting standoffs up higher because they can't fit their blade into the frame of the knife. But if you can actually see here, the blade is sunk pretty deep into there because of this little hump. And so you easily could have fit a standoff right on the tip of this hump, and it would have been completely fine, and there would have had to have been no adjustments made to the design or the blade to fit that, and that would have helped to eliminate some of the vibration, especially when the knife drops to a close. You get strong vibration all throughout the knife, and for me personally, that's a feeling of cheapness, and it's something that I expect not to exist on some of my more premium knives. So that is something to consider. If that doesn't bother you, then it won't be an issue, but it is something that I noticed. Now moving on, I will say that the action is not nearly snappy enough. It does drop shut, but it's a fairly big and heavy blade, so that's kind of to be expected. I have to say the action has grown on me the more that I've had it, because again, when I first opened the knife, I kind of was like, okay, that's not very snappy. It has a fairly light detent, and also the knife wasn't functioning super well. It wasn't quite dropping shut the way I would hope. It was, but it was a little bit too tight, and it just felt a little grungy. I did disassemble the knife and give it a nice full cleaning, and it's functioning much, much better now. So that was definitely a result of the secondary market. I have to say that for a knife this big, I would have preferred a snappier detent just so I could get that blade out with a little bit more, I don't know, just like it feels good when you get a good hit on the flipper tab. But if you are just kind of like tugging on it, it doesn't quite feel as authoritative. It reminds me a lot of the Bodega detent. The actual Bodegas like Field Grades and Midtechs and stuff have remarkably light detents considering the size of the blade and everything. And this very much feels along those same lines. I have to say it does drop shut extremely well. It's very, very smooth. And the only complaint is that when it actually does close, I get the vibration through the handle. So overall, the action is really great, but just doesn't have the kind of character that I look for in a knife at this price point. The difference between a good action and a great action and a world-class action, those lines are starting to blur a lot more as the whole idea of dropping shut and everything starts to matter more in the market. Obviously, if you go back a bunch of years when most people just had like traditional knives and the idea of the titanium frame lock flipper wasn't quite as mainstream as it is now, that wasn't quite as big of a deal. People were used to just closing their knives like this. You know what I mean? And that is still very much true to this day. But as many of you know, the whole idea of an action being great or smooth or dropping shut on ceramic bearings and everything, that is a little bit newer in the grand scheme of the knife market. And it's really hard to say that one is better than the other because people have different preferences on how fast the knife drops and stuff like that. But you can tell the difference between like a premium feel, you know, and objectively, just the amount of friction that you feel in the action and everything like that does make a difference. And so there's something about the action here that leaves a little bit to be desired, but that's certainly not to suggest that it's not excellent, because it is. The next thing that I want to mention is the fact that the knife has absolutely no lock stick and there is no steel lock bar insert, which I really appreciate. Anytime a steel lock bar insert is not added into a titanium knife, it's something that can be a little bit nerve-wracking because some makers are really good at just having good lockup with a titanium lock bar, and others introduce guaranteed lock stick. But then again, I've handled tons of knives that do have steel lock bar inserts that have terrible lock stick. My Shirogorov comes to mind, as well as almost every Shirogorov I've handled. They are out there without lock stick, but it is fairly common, and they all do have the steel lock bar inserts. So that was just something that I wanted to note. I feel like more and more these days I'm coming across knives that are completely excellent in every way, especially with like customs and stuff, and then you go to disengage the lock bar and there's lock stick and you're just kind of like, oh, that's a bummer. So it is completely worth noting that there is no lock stick on this knife, and that's something that I definitely appreciate. If you notice that it didn't have a steel lock bar insert and that concerned you, I would say do not be concerned. And again, I picked this knife up on the secondary, so it has been broken in and everything. So any wear that would come in and introduce lock stick over time appears to not be an issue, at least up to this point. So that seems completely reasonable. I do really wish the flipper tab had jimping on a knife with a blade this big. You really want to make sure that you make good contact with the flipper tab, because obviously if you don't, you're not going to get deployment, just like this. It is big enough that I don't find myself slipping off of it too much, and the fact that the knife is equipped with a light detent means that you're not going to end up quote-unquote fighting the flipper tab as much as you would on something that's a little bit stronger on the detent. Like the custom Knife Factory muscle that I had, that was something that I had a really big issue with. There was, I guess, light jimping on that flipper tab, but the detent was so incredibly strong that it was near impossible to break. So while I do prefer some jimping on a flipper tab, this is certainly the detent combination that works for not necessarily needing it on a knife like this. The blade is pretty cool. I love the finishes. I really like that it is this kind of stonewash on the grinds, and then you have the satin finish on the flats. It really, really looks great in my opinion. I like that the stonewash is very light, and that it's not like a huge contrast between the flats and the bevel. You guys know by now that I prefer working finishes on knives, especially knives that I plan to really get use out of. And so I definitely like the working finish on this, and then I like the nice touch of having the satin flat to bring a little bit more sheen and kind of match the sheen that you get out of the handle. So I'm really appreciative of the blade overall. I think the shape is really cool. And even though it's not quite the most useful blade shape, it does work really well. It has you have this awesome harpoon here, and that brings you to a great little tip for piercing. This thing's going to absolutely pierce through anything. The way the grinds work out with the swedge and this flat grind here, you get a really good piercing tip. It's very thin, kind of behind this whole area up until you get to the flat grind. And so that's going to do very well for piercing. And then for slicing, it does have the recurve grind, but it is fairly mellow, and it has a large flat grind behind it. It actually might be hollow grind. Let me look. I'm going to go ahead and say this is a hollow grind, actually, right here, although it is fairly mild. I should have looked at this before I started the video, I apologize, but that actually does look like a hollow grind in here, and it's very tall, and it's very thin behind the edge, so this is going to do very well for slicing. The tanto, the Japanese tanto shape out of the recurve is not nearly too aggressive. You can see it's kind of rounded off here on the actual cutting edge, and so you're not really going to notice this transition as much as you would on like an aggressive tanto like this Gavco here. So that's really good. I really appreciate the fact that even though it's this crazy compound grind, and when you initially look at the blade, you say, oh, wow, that's really complicated. You know, that doesn't look like the most usable blade shape. When you actually look at the details of how it's kind of all been brought together, it actually functions pretty well for such a big blade with so much going on. So that's definitely reasonable. I like this big belly here on the tanto section, and this is going to allow you to get into packages pretty well with the tanto edge. And yeah, I think overall the blade is actually surprisingly useful despite its kind of initial impression. Moving on, I think that the clip, it's fine. It doesn't make contact with the frame, which means that it's going to be really easy in and out of the pocket because you're not counteracting a bunch of tension that exists naturally within the clip. And so it works. It's nothing too special. It does leave quite a bit of the knife sticking out of your pocket, so that is something to consider if you're looking for something a little bit more tucked away. Although if you're buying a giant knife like this, you're probably not looking for tucked away, which is fair. So the clip works fine, but I wouldn't say that it's anything particularly special. I would call it average. The overall shape of the knife is pretty neat, but the ergonomics are, well, there's something that we need to talk about. So I do like the ergonomics for such a big knife. I just want to start out by saying that. It reminds me in some ways of the Bodega, particularly right here. If you actually go back and watch my Bodega video, you'll see me talk about the fact that the rear of the Bodega kind of drops off. It's kind of further up. It's right around here, but it has kind of this same dropping off point. And then the same is true of the harpoon on the blade. So on the Bodega, it kind of drops, and there's like a nice good section for you to get your thumb in on the harpoon. And so it has a very similar kind of feeling along the rear or along the spine of the knife as the Bodega. And when you grip the knife, you can see here that my hand fits pretty well. If I'm holding the knife pretty aggressively with this saber grip, my thumb is right here in the harpoon where I want it to be. My whole hand fits nicely into this curve that they've introduced on the inside of the handle. But I must say that I wear a medium glove, and a large glove would do very poorly with this knife because then your pinky would be trying to close around this area right here. So I just barely fit in here. You can see the kind of fat of my finger is just making contact with the base of the flipper tab, and then you can see here kind of the fat of my pinky is making contact with the very edge of this little tip here. So while this is perfect ergonomically for my hand, I typically tend to think that bigger knives are more appreciated by people with bigger hands, and for this being such a big knife, this would not be comfortable for a big hand because you have this design choice at the end here. So it's kind of counterintuitive in that sense of, you know, most of the time you want a knife that kind of fits. Obviously, people carry knives for all kinds of different reasons, and some people like big knives because they're cool, and some people like little knives because they're super carryable. But I would just think that if you were going to go buy a 9-inch knife or whatever, that you would maybe have bigger hands, which wouldn't work super well. So that's kind of an odd choice to me, that you're kind of eliminating a big part of the bigger hand market on such a large knife. Speaking of size, I do just now realize that I never did the PM2 comparison, so let's go ahead and get her lined up. So you can see here that the fallout is definitely longer, but remarkably not as much longer as you might think, though the PM2 is a fairly big knife to begin with. But it is very wide or thick in this dimension, which you can see. It's not quite as much in the handle, even though it does widen quite a bit here towards kind of the bolster area. But the thinness is actually kind of the same right in the middle of the knife. You have kind of a similarly shaped index finger area, which is nice, but you can see as the PM2 kind of tapers off, you have this is right where the kind of point is on the fallout, whereas the point is much further down on the PM2, making for an overall longer grip area, which again is going to be better for those bigger hands that I mentioned before. So it is kind of something to consider that the handle grip area is significantly smaller on this knife, despite its overall larger size. So that's pretty much going to do it for this one on the features and flaws, guys. As far as story time is concerned, I picked this knife up, like I said, because of the really awesome anodization. The fallout was something that I kind of had my eye on for a while. I wasn't super sure about the knife. When I went to Blade Show, I did get to check out the one that belongs to my friend Jake. Follow him on Instagram here. And you know, when I tried the knife, I was like, oh, that's kind of cool, but I didn't see myself as wanting to own one. And yet only weeks later, this appeared on Reddit's Knife Swap, and I went ahead and snagged it. The price was really good. The anodization really, really did it for me. I think I'm going to have a lot of fun getting some sweet pictures of this knife. And so that was a big part of it for me, was just this aesthetic presentation side. But also I really wanted to be able to throw up a video on one, because I see these floating around, and not a lot of people tend to talk about them. And so I thought it was worthwhile having one up on the internet. And there is a chance that if my friend Taylor comes through for me, that he will ship me a Riate version, and so I can do a little bit of a comparison between the Midtech and the Riate production version. Now, I don't want to put him out. He has not guaranteed that that's possible, because I think he is looking to sell the knife, so if somebody does make an offer on it, obviously it's going to take off. But I think that I could poke around the community a little bit and hopefully find a production version, because I'm really interested to see if Riate took such an awesome design and then made some of those considerations that I spoke about before, with sort of like the thinness of the handles or the lack of contouring thereof, and if they've done anything with the disengagement section of the lock bar. So yeah, and it would also, I think, be cool to put up the actions one against the other. So definitely try to keep an eye out for that, or of course if you do have a Riate version and you would like to send it on as a lovely loaner for that comparison, I would very much appreciate that. You can of course email me at tovarishworks@gmail.com. If you want to see awesome pictures of all these beautiful knives, including the presentation side of this one in HD, you can of course follow me on Instagram at tovarishworks. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.